If all these people had been doing their jobs, it wouldn't matter what Tommy Robinson had or had not said. All of this is a deflection. It's always this way. Let's leap at one of the people who has responded to this and say they did it wrong, and then we can keep on not addressing the question. And I think this is a uniquely British vice.
Hello and welcome to the Americano show. I am delighted to be joined by Douglas Murray, who is in the Spectator's office, where I am not. I am in the Isle of Wight.
Conspicuously not.
I am in the Isle of Wight. I'm looking forward to joining the office next week. But for now, I am here in the island, looking with great interest at my various social media feeds and the story that is blowing up all over the place, largely from American accounts. Elon Musk, a lot of people in Trump world talking about it too. And that is the story of grooming gangs or raping gangs, really, in Britain, which has been a bubbling scandal for many years, but usually touched by people who are considered a bit persona non grata by the mainstream media. And yet now you're getting a lot of pressure from American voices, loud American voices, about this story, and a lot of pressure on the British government. And Elon Musk and others are calling for the king even to intervene and to get rid of Keir Starmer's awful government. Douglas Murray, I would like to ask you about this story. I noticed that you've actually been tweeting about it yourself. Why does it take Americans to put the spotlight on this story?
Well, first of all, I'm not entirely sure that it has taken it. It's certainly taken some Americans to blow the story up to an international story, really, in a way that it hasn't very often. The rape gangs story has been bubbling away in Britain now for a quarter of a century. It's almost 25 years since various people, in particular in towns in the north of England, places like Rotherham, Rochdale, parents of girls started saying that their girls were being groomed by men whom were soon after euphemistically described as Asians whenever they were described in the British press. But it wasn't just white working class people who it seems somehow very easy to disparage and dismiss. It was also Sikh and Hindu communities who said that some similar things were happening with their daughters, and specifically that the people who were sexually abusing, raping, and so-called grooming their daughters were men, predominantly Muslim men of Pakistani, North African, and other Muslim heritage. This was, I remember it very well when it first started to come out in the early 2000s. This was a story so grotesque and so almost as if it had come from the fevered brain of a sort of the most extreme racist fringe. It was such a hideous story that the first reaction seemed to be, among a lot of people in councils, police forces, and then in the media, that it really would be better if this story was suppressed. And it was suppressed. A few years after it was already well known, Channel 4 in about 2004-05, I think, did a documentary into this. And so-called anti-fascist groups in the UK, among others, and the Labour government, or members of the Labour government, persuaded the Channel 4 to delay the broadcast until after the local elections in case its broadcast helped the British National Party, which was actually a far-right political party in the UK and is long defunct. So that was a taster of it. And over the 20 years or so since, this story has bubbled away, sometimes erupted again, not least when it turned out that it was not just a few northern towns that this was happening in, but many towns, and indeed leafy places like Oxfordshire, where in the centre of Oxford, a colossal grooming rape gang was discovered to have been abusing local girls, raping local girls. It came out in places like Telford, in many other places, dozens of British cities. And there were some journalists, it has to be said, who did highlight this. Andrew Norfolk of the Times memorably did. But there was always this desire to sort of keep the story down. And you could tell that, not least by the fact that, as I say, that police, and there are many accounts of this, police would actually ignore girls, ignore the families of girls, sometimes actually arrested the families of girls, the victims. And you could see it from things like, I remember when one of the grooming scandal trials happened a few years ago in London at the Old Bailey. I was there for a bit of it. And if you spoke to the relatives of the accused afterwards, these wives and children were all claiming that their relatives were totally innocent and had been put up to it, of course, by the totally Islamophobic, racist British state. So that was the kind of atmosphere that this all happened in for a quarter of a century now.
Well, another figure who was very involved in talking about it and trying to raise it as a story was, of course, Tommy Robinson, who is now being cited, his videos being tweeted and so on by people like Elon Musk again. I'm sorry to bang on about Elon Musk, but he is a bit of a one-man media universe at the moment. And his role is now causing political tensions. Bloomberg have just published a story that senior political figures, we don't know who exactly, are raising the alarm with Team Trump about how toxic a figure Tommy Robinson is, and that perhaps people even within the Reform Party, who, again, Team Trump seems to be close to, are concerned that promoting Tommy Robinson is not in their best interests. What do you make of that?
Well, I'll tell you what I make of it. First of all, I mean, it has been the tendency of our country of birth, Great Britain, to always try to deflect attention from this scandal and, in fact, to pour opprobrium on anyone who actually exposed this scandal. I think, for instance, you mentioned I weighed into it a little. I didn't particularly. I reposted today 4 pages of a book I wrote 10 years ago that came out in 2017 called The Strange Death of Europe. And in 4 pages of that book, near the beginning, I wrote about this scandal as emblematic of the way in which Britain, European countries, and the West as a whole were utterly incapable of dealing with any of the downsides of mass immigration and failed integration. And in that, I mentioned the heroic former Labour MP, Anne Cryer, who was a constituency Labour MP for one of the areas where parents had come to her saying what had happened to their daughters. I mean, stories so lurid and appalling that we probably couldn't actually get into the details here. And Anne Cryer, after identifying that in about 2009 and trying to raise the alarm, was not only smeared as an Islamophobe, this is a lifelong left-wing working-class Labour MP, was not only smeared as an Islamophobe and a racist, but required police protection for a period. So this attempt to shoot the messenger, almost literally, was something that has been a consistent aspect of this story. And when I see people now talking about this story and trying to get onto the Tommy Robinson part of it, I can't help thinking it's yet another deflection. Tommy Robinson is a man from a working class background in Luton. There are many things to be said in favour of him and what he's done. There's many things to be said criticising some of his tactics and some of his words and much more. But essentially, he is one of a quite large number, actually, not to be underestimated, a large number of working class people in this country who saw this happen to relatives of theirs, who had girls in their families who were drugged and raped by Muslim gangs. And when they went to the police, they didn't get any help. When they went to the council, they didn't get any help. When they went to their MPs, generally they didn't get any help. If they organised a protest movement, so-called anti-fascist groups would immediately say, far right, because, of course, if you're working class in our country and you don't like the mass rape of young white girls, you're, of course, necessarily must be a Nazi. All of this was done to make it utterly impossible for anybody to discuss this, and particularly to crack down as hard as possible on anyone who was white and working class and felt voiceless. And instead of giving these people any sympathy or any hearing, most of the media, most of the political class turned away. And I'm afraid what we've been seeing in recent days is one perfectly predictable repercussion of that. You can keep a scandal this big down for only so long. And of course, there are Labour MPs and others at the moment who are saying, but don't you know we've had lots of inquiries into this? Don't you know lots of people have gone to jail? And there is some truth in that. First of all, the inquiries meant very little in the end. They did very little to sort out this problem. Secondly, the number of accusations of rapes, the number of girls in all of these towns who say they've been raped, means that the proportion of men who have actually been convicted, often already released, but convicted and went to prison, can only be a fraction of the number of people who actually took part in this obscene sexual crime. And so this sort of idea of like, it's okay, guys, we've got it. It's total bunk. And, I think that part of the thing we've seen in recent days is very reminiscent, and I've written about this again in the past, it's very reminiscent of something that Britain is astonishingly good at, which is avoiding primary problems by trying to highlight people who, as it were, who mention the problem, or mention the problem in an inadequate way, or in a way that isn't to everyone's taste or more, and then everyone talks about them, and it's horribly reminiscent of the way in which you'll remember that for about some 40 years or so, it was said in Britain that we couldn't discuss mass immigration, legal or illegal, in Britain because Enoch Powell gave one speech in 1968. And actually all it was a terrific way for the political class and others to avoid talking about mass migration. They say, Enoch made it impossible. And it's awfully reminiscent, this. People saying, Tommy Robinson made it impossible. That's absolute nonsense. If you have a courageous media, if you have just independent-minded people, if you have councillors who know how to do their darn job, and policemen who are not, as the reports and commissions found out, incredibly scared of being accused of institutional racism, which of course has been hanging over the police force for some 40 years now, 30 years certainly. If all these people have been doing their jobs, it wouldn't matter what Tommy Robinson had or had not said. All of this is a deflection. It's always this way. Let's leap at one of the people who has responded to this and say they did it wrong, and then we can keep on not addressing the question. And I think this is a uniquely British vice.
What you're talking about there makes me think about the aftermath of the Southport riots. And a lot of people who are commenting about this online, particularly Americans, and I think it's interesting that Americans, or outsiders anyway, seem to notice this more than British people, and certainly British journalists, that in the aftermath of the Southport riots, you had a lot of people arrested and even jailed for saying offensive stuff online. And then you put that against a scandal like the grooming, the raping scandal that we're talking about, where there is a sort of suppression of the truth for a long time, or certainly a stifling of it. Mm-hmm. Yes. A lot of people think that means we are living in a country where free speech doesn't really exist. And for a long time, just saying that was enough to make you seem strangely, absurdly right-wing. But there is a grain of truth in that point.
I think there's more than a grain of truth in it. But I'd add one caveat, which is that I think I don't often, as it were, confess my privilege. But let me do it for a moment. There are some of us in the British media, and a very small number of people in the British political class, who have spoken about this issue and related issues for many, many years, indeed decades now. And I'm not saying that is the easiest thing. It's always easier to write the latest piece about what is going on in the mind of Rachel Reeves today or something. I'm not saying it's the easiest story to cover because, of course, you get all the accusations anyway, but it doesn't matter to me. I don't think that caring about backlash or anything is remotely of interest, and journalists shouldn't do it. But I would say that some of us have got a voice, and I feel, at any rate, rather privileged to have that voice and try to use it. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people in the UK do not have columns in The Spectator or the ability to get books published and much more. And the question I've asked for many years now is, what are you allowed to say, and what are you allowed to do, and how are you allowed to express yourself if you don't have the platform that some of us have worked to get? because it's not just luck, obviously, but you work for it. But I mean, still, there's some privilege in getting that position. But what are you allowed to do if your daughter has been raped by a Muslim gang in one of these towns, and, for instance, you go to the local authorities and the local authorities tell you that it's your 13-year-old daughter's fault? And I go one other step further on this, something that's come up in the last couple of days as this has got to this extraordinary attention finally. I wrote many years ago when the Oxfordshire grooming gang, rape gang case, actually some of those people did come to trial. I wrote about that one of the heads of the council in Oxfordshire, whose remit, among other things, was the care of children in that constituency. It turned out that the local care authorities had failed on multiple occasions. On one occasion, there was a girl that was meant to be in their care. She had been drugged and groomed and gang raped by a group of Muslim men in Oxford repeatedly. And one night, she managed to escape in a cab and got back to her care home that was overseen by the local council. And when she got there, she couldn't pay for the fare. And the people at the care home who had a duty of care over her didn't pay the fare. The girl's rapists came back and found her and took her away again and did it again. Now, the council head who was in charge of the welfare of girls in that area, many years later, when one of these trials was finished, gave a video, which I actually wrote about at the time. This is more than 10 years ago now. I wrote about it at the time on Spectator blogs. And she gave a video where she said, and I'm going to have to do an impression because it was so disgusting. She said, "I'd like to make an apology for the breakdown of social services that have been exposed in elements of this trial." You would have thought this woman was some railway employee apologising for leaves on the line that meant that the 805 from Oxford to London had been delayed by 20 minutes. Not that she had overseen a system in which people who were meant to have a duty of care over vulnerable girls actually helped the rapists of those girls. It was utterly disgusting. And that's just one case. And there's case after case of that, of police chiefs in Rochester, of councillors in places like Telford, of MPs who knew about this, and then gave mealy-mouthed apologies years later, if they apologised at all. And not one of these people suffered, not just did they not go to prison, most of them didn't even lose their jobs. And the ones who did move on from those jobs moved on to other perfectly good jobs in the same or similar local authorities. And I think that, and I've always thought that, and always said that is a scandal on top of a scandal. And I'm relieved in some ways that this has finally got some more international attention, but everybody should have known this at the time. And I can say this because a lot of people did know it at the time. And a lot of people tried to raise these concerns. But in the end, Freddie, I'll tell you why it didn't break as a story to the extent it should have done. Police, MPs, council officials, and others, including the CPS, decided it was more important not to give what they saw as a gift to the phantasm of the far right in the UK, not to give them the gift of this story. And, that just goes to a very interesting question in our country, which is the job of the police, the CPS, local councillors, MPs and others to squash stories that might show a community in a bad light, including for cover-ups within that community, because, oh gosh, were there cover-ups. Is it to protect that, or is it actually just to pursue justice and the rule of law? And I'd say it's that, justice and the rule of law. And that was exactly what was put as a secondary or tertiary priority by all of these figures of authority in the UK for a quarter of a century.
Well, and one of those figures, of course, although there's not a lot of direct evidence against him, was Keir Starmer, who was director of the Crown Prosecution Service. And you also have other senior Labour figures who were, in positions where they could have done more to help expose this story, and they did not. Jess Phillips being one that's getting a bit of attention at the moment.
Well, can I just give an example of the Jess Phillips thing, by the way? Don't forget, I thought many years ago when she arrived on the scene that Jess Phillips was a rather interesting MP and a rather interesting voice. I think she's very smart, very talented politically. And I watched her in her first years in office, and I will never personally be able to forget her response to exactly this sort of crime when it happened in Cologne on, I think it was New Year's Eve 2016, when her fellow women were mass molested in a European centre, as a centre of a European city. She said on Question Time that this wasn't much different to an average Saturday night in Birmingham city centre. In other words, I've got more faith in Birmingham than perhaps Jess Phillips does. I don't think that it is actually mass gang rape at all bar one in Birmingham on a Saturday night. But what she and others like her, so-called feminists, were doing was minimizing mass molestation on that occasion of grown-up women as well as underage girls, minimizing that, in the name of community tensions, and as a secondary thing on that occasion, smearing her own constituents. And that whole thing has been the prevailing issue of the era on this. And Jess Phillips and all these others all fell into it too. They didn't have the courage of their predecessors like the great Anne Cryer. They didn't have the courage to identify things when they happened and to tell the truth. They didn't. They put all of this community cohesion stuff ahead of it, and they were cowards.
Let's get back to that deflection point, because that ties into the cowardice, I think. And as you put it at the beginning, there's this tendency in Britain to always focus on a secondary or tertiary point. And I think we're already doing that now with, the story is going to be, do we want the Trumpy American right to run Britain? When really the Trumpy American right are just expressing horror at this story. Why is it? Why is it that the Brits, that we British people, have this tendency? Is it that our old sense of politesse has been transferred onto the sort of multicultural dogma that we all live with now? What is it exactly?
It's lots of things. It's partly the result of a systematic attempt to degrade and demoralise the native population of Britain. It's been going on for generations. As I say, I've written whole books about it. You open any week's newspapers today and you'll see the Labour government wants to teach more about Britain's awful past, because obviously what we need in Britain is for people who were born here and people coming here to be told that this is a ghastly, awful, racist country. By the way, always rather interesting that so many people want to come here if we are such a ghastly, awful, racist country, but let's park that for the moment. It's always this attempt to degrade this country, to demoralise its people, to tell us we don't have anything much to be proud of, apart from queuing and, fair play, and also diversity, because obviously for 1,000 years, the whole thing that has created this extraordinarily impressive and important culture in Britain is just diversity. It was just we didn't have any native culture ourselves, of course. We had to become diverse in order to become anything like a reasonable or decent country. These are all the memes that every day's news is filled with. And, I'm utterly opposed to that, as you know, and some viewers who don't know me may have guessed. I'm utterly opposed to that. I think it's disgraceful. I think that people have a right to have some pride in their culture. I think that of all people, and I think it of the British people as well. I think we have the right to be proud of our country. I think we have the right not to be told to shut up. But there has been, it's true, there is an innate decency in, I think, the British people. One of the reasons why we have welcomed in so many people, with some success, some serious not success as well, but is because we are actually welcoming and decent and tolerant and much more. You wouldn't know it from the way we're misrepresented. But yes, we are those things. But you play around with stories like this one, and you diminish them, and you sit on people, and you imprison people who complain about it, and you release rapists from prison to free up cell space for somebody who's written something unwise or correct too early on social media. And you just see how long the British public will put up with that. I mean, they've put up with it for a lot longer than I thought already. But I don't think that tolerance is infinite. I think it's a very stupid idea to say to the native population of Britain, particularly the white working classes, you are nobodies. You don't deserve to be listened to. And we don't care what happens to your daughters because more important community over here. I think it's incredibly stupid. And like everyone else, I have in mind all the time those figures from our own past who have warned us about this part of the British psyche, as with the European psyche, that can only be pushed so far. Rudyard Kipling is the obvious one, when the English learned to hate, when the English began to hate. You do this to people long enough, and people become very hate-filled, very hate-filled. And any sensible politician of left or right should realize that. And
or is it that, I mean, in America, you have the same things in America, the same hatred of the West, hatred of the origins of the country in America. But you also have strong antibody resistance within American thinking, within American culture and society. In Britain,
yes,
although you're suggesting a backlash may come or may be coming, it doesn't seem to have manifested itself in quite the same way yet. I wonder if that's partly to do with the scale of the problem that we are facing, because although we have had much success at multicultural and integration in some ways, we also have huge problems with it, and they are problems that our political class are not willing to confront, and not just our political class, our middle class perhaps are not willing to confront.
Oh yeah, lots of people aren't willing to confront it. I mean, one of the interesting things about so-called white flight is that middle-class people who can up sticks sell their home that's more valuable than it was when they bought it by several times and move out to a slightly more leafy area or market town. They can do that. The white working class have much less ability to move. So when something happens in their area and they don't like it, they're stuck with it. They have far less mobility in every sense, and every study shows us. Why is it that we at Spectator have written about this many, many times over many, many years, that young white working class men are the most underperforming section in British state schools? Well, they don't have any privilege, and nobody gives them a pass. And so there's much to be said about that. But I just want to say about this thing about the comparison with America. Yeah, Americans have been beaten down quite a lot in recent years. But there's also a lot of people there who won't take it. And I mean that in political terms as well. They have political leaders, obviously most recently Donald Trump, who's partly an expression of that kind of, we're going to attack America and say the founding fathers were all just slave-owning, racist scum. We're going to hit back and reclaim our story on this. And they are doing that. Britain, by contrast, partly because of the utter failure of the Conservative Party over 14 years when it was in government and coalition, partly because of the Labour Party, partly because of everything that's happened since Tony Blair's government opened the borders after 1997. For all of these reasons, it's been deemed the only way to get through this is to talk up every culture apart from our own. And that's what we've done. That's what we've done. To make people feel better about integrating into this society, we've said, great, because we're not any good as a society and we need you, immigrants. And, I'm afraid that's just not true. Let me give you a very quick analogy. I know this is a bit long-winded, but just bear with me. My friend Eric Weinstein pointed out to me some years ago when we were talking about this, he thought when he was growing up as a boy that vanilla was the base flavor of ice cream. In other words, when you make ice cream, you start with vanilla and then you add flavor to it to make it strawberry or raspberry or whatever. And of course, that's not the case. Vanilla itself is a flavor. Britain, let's say, is vanilla, was vanilla, without any connotations around that, other than to say it's a flavor. And in fact, a very complicated and rather delicious flavor. Other flavors were added to it, but it is not the case that Britain was a flavorless country until other cultures came and gave us culture. We had a very complicated, beautiful, generally very well-working vanilla recipe in the UK that took centuries of, apart from anything else, racial wars between the four nations of this country, with religious wars within our country that went on for centuries. We took a long time to come to the Enlightenment, and particularly the Scottish Enlightenment that broke out so well. But this was a very, very complicated vanilla. And when people now play around with this and just throw in any old flavor, including really poisonous ones, things like people who believe that they can mass rape young girls because they are, to quote one of the judges in one of the cases of the grooming gangs, because they're easy meat. That is a poison added to the collective ice cream. And I don't see why it hasn't been possible for years to say, we don't want that particular strand of flavor. We don't want people who come with attitudes towards women which are at best 7th century. At best. We don't want it. And if you're going to come here, welcome. If you want to join into it, welcome. Be our guests, be our brothers, be our neighbors. But if you come here with that, no, don't want it. Get out. Go. Now, when was the last time anyone in the political class in Britain really had the guts to say that? Not often, and it's to our detriment. But a lot of people notice it now. A lot of people notice it. The world knows it now.
Well, Douglas, that's a very brilliant way of putting it. And I want to congratulate you on stretching out the ice cream metaphor for that long. It was very well done. And finally, Douglas, I do want to ask you very quickly about, I talk to people in Trump world, you talk to a lot of people in Trump world, including perhaps Donald Trump himself. And there's a lot of people in that world that are talking about Britain with almost a kind of nostalgic sorrow that you would normally expect to hear from old British conservatives, that Britain has gone to the dogs, and that America might be in a position to help to kind of rescue it politically. That's obviously what Elon Musk is trying to do, albeit perhaps often in a trolling way online. Can they help Britain? Can they come to Britain's rescue? Should they? Do we want them to? Might it backfire politically? Because British people don't usually like to be told what to do by foreigners.
Well, I don't think anyone's telling the British what to do. There are people in America who are highlighting what has gone wrong. And sometimes, by the way, it does actually need a friend to intervene to tell you where you've gone wrong. Everyone has that in their lives. Sometimes the person observing your life knows something about your life better than you do, including things that you've suppressed or kept down or haven't faced up to. That's very, very familiar. And it's the same with countries. Sometimes your friends are better at identifying your problems than you are. Somebody in Britain might be, we have these gangs that rape underage girls, but it's just happened a lot, but we're getting on with it. Maybe it requires a friend to step in and say, maybe you shouldn't have just got on with it. Maybe you should have dealt with it. Maybe you should have got to the core of it. So sometimes that's needed. As for the state of Britain at the moment, well, it's not very easy at the moment to find very positive things to say about the way we're governed. Very hard to say with taxes rising and everyone is still flattering the National Health Service when no one can get an appointment and people are left to die on hospital corridors. Anyone who's had to deal with the NHS in recent times should have no particular love for the amount of money we've been asked to pour into it. Yet, we have that. We have police who don't come when there's a crime. We have police who don't care when your car's broken into and even won't investigate if you've got CCTV of it. We've got police in areas of our country, whole forces that haven't solved a home burglary for years. And that's the police. Sorry, I mean the same people who are the crack anti-Twitter squad, of course. They're very good at sitting on their asses, eating digestive biscuits and scrolling through Twitter. Bit harder, it turns out, to just go out, find the CCTV and find a robber. But anyway, yeah, it's quite hard at the moment to find anything in the UK that's working well. But that isn't to say that we should be down on the UK, because we have great people in this country, great people. And if they could be reminded to emulate the greatness of our past, rather than to spit on our past and to hate our past, we could still have a great future. As I always say, instead of trying to destroy our history, why don't we try to make history? We've been quite good at that in the past.
Well, why not indeed, Douglas? I think we will end it there. Let's put this episode into the freezer next to the vanilla ice cream. And thank you very much for coming on to Americano.